Welcome back, everyone. Can you believe it is already our fourth week of this collaboration series? Feels like it is flying by. As usual, I have a couple of announcements and then I will pass it off to our speakers. So this is the final session of our collaboration series, as you know. If you missed our communication series back in February, it was a phenomenal series in partnership with Gonzaga University, and all of those recordings are on our website, as are the recordings from this series as well. And we will finish out our 2021 webinars in June when we do our series on Inspire and Serve with Lisa Berglund from Gold Dog Media. So I encourage you to hop on our website and register. And golf, I can't believe it, golf is just around the corner. I keep thinking that June is months away, but someone brought it to my attention today that June 11th is only 5 weeks away. We would love to have you join us in Walla Walla for the first of our 2 golf tournaments. We have plenty of space, so please hop on, register today. Walla Walla is a great place. You can make it a weekend. We have a lot of alumni in that area who have businesses and wineries, so it could definitely be an ag forestry weekend extravaganza. And last but not least, we are recruiting for seminar teams. So we are looking for fine folks like yourselves to help us plan our seminars for upcoming classes. This is an opportunity to help with the agenda, to provide recommendations, help get us connected with speakers in your industry or your local area. And I think everybody's favorite part is getting to attend the seminar with the class, because who doesn't want to kind of repeat their ag forestry experience? So we would love to have you join us in putting together seminars. Please apply to be a seminar team member today, and you can do that on our website, agforestry.org/seminar teams. So without further ado, I want to hand it over to Michael Kern, who you know. Michael is the executive director at the Ruckelshaus Center, and he is going to introduce our 2 speakers today, Urban Eberhart and Paul Ward.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Great to be back with you all. Thanks again for the invitation to be part of this series. This is the 4th of 4 webinars, as Hannah mentioned, on collaborative governance. The first was an introduction. The second, we focused on collaborative competencies. The third was my colleague Amanda Murphy talking about one of the early phases of a collaborative process, situation assessments, and how that works. I was able to capture her presentation, but not to stay for all of the Q&A portion of that. But it's, I'm glad you had the opportunity to learn more about how, we begin a collaborative process, how we assess ripeness for a collaborative approach, and how that's, part of a formal collaborative process, but how so much of the assessment can be applicable whether you're participating in a formal collaborative process or not. And now we wanted to wrap it up with, what we're calling, and why don't I share my screen so you can actually see what we're calling it. Collaboration in action. So what does it look like when you're sort of on the ground from the point of view of participants? And we're really lucky to have a couple of our Ruckelshaus Center board members join us who are participants from the agriculture and forestry and natural resource sectors, and they're going to share their perspectives on that. So our participation in this series, as I've mentioned before, is part of the Center's Collaborative Capacity Building Initiative, by which we help individuals and organizations better understand, initiate, participate in, and lead collaborative public policy efforts. And that initiative receives funding from the Murdoch Charitable Trust. So we want to say thank you to them for that important support. As always, if Hannah, if you guys are able to put up the poll, I'd love to begin by just checking in with the folks participating, just to see what percentage of you is in the room at the moment, and where is the rest of you? How focused are you able to be on this content as we get going? And then if you could just type into the chat, just to get your chat fingers and thinking started, where is the rest of you? What else is occupying your attention as we get going today? And I guess I can say I'm about 90% in the room today. About 10% of me is trying to wrestle with technical challenges. I taught a class last night and I need to post the video from that class, and I can't figure out how to make some edits to the video. So part of me is a little distracted on technical stuff, but other than that, I feel like I'm completely here. So anyway, yeah, go ahead and cast your vote for what percentage is there, and then we'll share those results. And I'm seeing that let's see. Hey, you're doing pretty well today. We've got somebody who's fairly well distracted. Most of you are 70s or up, and I can see someone's having their lunch. I haven't got there yet. Oh, someone's having beautiful weather. I can tell you that in Seattle, the beautiful weather has left us for a while. Birds outside the window. I've got nothing but lawn mowing and construction outside my window. Preparing for a conference, taking care of kids, eating lunch. Yeah, well, it is a lunchtime webinar, so eating lunch is a perfectly reasonable distraction to have going on. Well, thanks for the info. Hope will be compelling enough to be a distraction for your lunch, and keep raising those percentages up ways towards the 90% range. Great. Let's see. Let's talk about what we're going to try and do while we spend some time together today. Oh, first of all, last time I was with you, you had to put up with all my examples of collaborative competencies using folks from different fantasy films or stuff like that. I thought I'd throw in one more Game of Thrones reference for you. I try to collect humorous collaboration related quotes and stuff like that, as you've probably seen in the last couple. This is one more. We had Arya Stark from Game of Thrones in those examples. This is her sister Sansa. I think she's actually speaking to Arya. And I like this as a collaboration quote. I'm sure cutting off heads is very satisfying, but it's not the way you get people to work together. So you may agree or not agree with that, but I would probably say Sansa Stark ends up being a better collaborator than Arya Stark as the series progresses, but I won't do any more spoilers than that. Okay, objectives for this session. We're going to explore how farmers and tribes do have a history of conflict in our region, but also have a lot in common and much to gain from collaborative governance. We're going to hear from a couple of leaders from those communities in the Yakima Valley, and hear in particular how they've built both a personal and a professional relationship, how those relationships have helped make large and small things possible via collaborative governance regimes, which is a term that comes out of the literature, like the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, the Columbia Basin Partnership, and others. We'll learn how that collaborative governance work and those relationships have been shaped by those who've come before Urban and Paul, how they themselves are influencing the next generation of leaders in their area, and what relevance those experiences might have for professionals like yourselves from other parts of the state and the region, and discuss opportunities, but also the real challenges that are involved when you're trying to make meaningful and lasting progress. So that's what we're trying to do today. And let's talk a little bit about who these two distinguished personages are that we've pulled into our virtual room today. First of all, Paul Ward, some of you may know, he's got about 20 years of experience in Columbia River fisheries management. He's Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Prior to that, Paul was fisheries manager for the Yakama Nation, worked on fisheries habitat and Hanford Nuclear Reservation issues. He formerly served on boards like the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board, the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board, the State Board of Trustees for the Nature Conservancy, and the Yakima Valley Community Foundation. So lots of different boards. He's an enrolled member of the Yakama Nation, a 3-time a graduate at University of Washington. That's why he's proudly wearing his UW jacket in that photograph. He's got a BA in history, a JD from the School of Law, and has also got an executive MPA from the UW's Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, which is the Ruckelshaus Center's host unit at UW. Paul and his 3 children live on the Yakima Reservation, Central Washington, and he's also a proud alumni of Ag Forestry's, I believe it's class 29. I got that right? Yep, class 29. And Paul is a member of the Ruckelshaus Center's Advisory Board and the executive committee of that advisory board. So Urban Eberhart is a farmer. He's been leading the way in planning for climate adaptation. Urban grew up on a farm in central Washington's Kittitas Valley. And Urban's a natural born leader. He's been a leader in the agricultural community. He was a member of the Future Farmers of America's parliamentary procedure team when he was in high school. He served as legislative affairs chairman and president of the Kittitas County Farm Bureau in the 80s and the early 90s. And he was first elected to the board of directors for the Kittitas Reclamation District all the way back in 1986. Urban's seen much change in the agricultural community and its needs over the past 30 years or more. And he's been an outspoken leader for finding solutions to adapt to a changing climate, including being a leading agricultural representative of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. So that's just a little bit of the many things that we could probably say about Paul and Urban. And so a couple of other things I wanted to say before I sort of turn it over to them and try to lead a conversation with them. The first is to talk a little bit about the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, because it's an example of a large-scale, long-term collaborative governance process that they've both been involved in. And I found this slide on the website for the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan. It sort of shows how the plan evolved over, like a 30-year time frame from studies beginning and then sort of a phase 1 set of work happening in the 80s, leading to phase 2 work in the 90s, and then to the integrated plan coming together in the 2000s. And I don't know if one or both of you want to briefly describe the plan and its goals. I would imagine maybe some of the attendees are familiar with the effort, and I don't want to sort of sidetrack us into a long conversation about the integrated plan, but is there sort of like an elevator speech about the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan that one or both of you wants to make an attempt at sharing as context? I sort of thought maybe this, and then I got a next slide about the Columbia Basin Partnership Forum, and maybe if one of you wants to do the elevator speech for one and the other one wants to do it for the other, that might be a good way to tee up before we get into sort of some specific conversation.
So Michael, I'll start with the integrated plan, and I'll do much better than an elevator speech. I think I heard Hannah say that maybe the next round of classes for this group are going to be storytelling and how to tell your story. That'll be coming up next month, I believe. And we were running into that same problem is how do we really explain this complex project that we're working on that is really we've mapped out the next 30 years and we have authorization for the next 30 years of work that we're going to do. And that's built on top of the act that first passed in 1979. So it's a $4 billion project and it's all very complicated. So one of the things that the Nature Conservancy actually did was invite a few folks from throughout the state over through their Floodplains by Designs process program in 2018 to really help us figure out how to tell the story about what it's all about. So I am going to start with a fairy tale discussion, really mapping out the past 30,000 years and sending us into the future that my sister Sophie and I put together on one of my many trips to Washington, D.C., working on the integrated plan. She lives in Virginia. So this was actually written in the hills of Northern Virginia. So I start out with an introduction, and I'm going to try to wrap this whole thing up in under 5 minutes. So start out, my name is Urban Eberhart. I grew up farming and irrigating in the Badger Pocket area of the Kittitas Valley. I manage the Kittitas Reclamation District and represent irrigated agricultural interests on the Yakima River Basin Water Enhancement Project Work Group. I'm here to tell you a story about the river that is the life of our area. The title is Setting Up for Survival, A River Basin Endures. A long time ago, but just a moment in the memories of Earth, the land walked through the seasons with steady strides in a place now known as the Yakima. In winter, a thick blanket of snow and ice lay across the mountain ranges and covered the valleys below. The warmth of the spring and summer melted the snow little by little. Water soaked into the flat places and trickled down rocky cliffs, waking seeds and dormant roots, bringing meadows into bloom, nourishing animals and gladdening the hearts of people who lived there. And so it happened year after year. Mountains held their snowpack into summer with the promise of cool water for when the sun shone long and hot across the arid land. Cold water flowed steadily through streams and ever larger rivers. Fish journeyed to the ocean and then finally back to the headwaters to spawn, as it was in their nature to do. One day, it so happened that people arrived who were new to the land. They had a great desire for more water to support farms and families. Forests were cut and cleared, rivers were dammed with little consideration for how fish would find their way to and from their homes at the furthest edges of lakes and streams. When the rains came, instead of soaking in, it swept off the steep, treeless slopes, taking with it everything in its path. Roots lost their grip. Meadows were ripped open in great gaping bites. The ground baked. Stream beds lay emptied or carried water too warm for the fish who had thrived there for so long. When the winter snows and summer rains failed to appear, people started to fight over what water was left. No matter how hard they fought with each other, there was never enough to go around. It had so happened that one day a small group got together. They were seasoned adversaries and equally matched. They told each other, "We're not getting anywhere. We're doing a great job of tripping each other up, but nothing is being accomplished." They concluded the problem could not be solved by continuing to fight. A plan was needed for everyone's survival: families, farms, fish, and forests. It was all connected. The first meeting was difficult as mistrust and wariness had long prevailed. Yet each of the former adversaries were heartened and returned to their people in order to gain support for this new approach. They were able to gather together a much larger group and called it the Yarbwep Work Group. Over time, trust grew, anger and bitterness seeped away as the entire team tackled each of the concerns with respect and civility and shared meals. Team members, now friends, could be relied upon to care about more than just their own narrow interests. The group made a plan to create fish passage at creeks and dams, cool the overheated waterways, repair damaged forests and eroded streams, and create more water storage for all. It took many years and many steps to move along this new path. Envoys were sent to seek outside help with their tasks, and soon word of their efforts spread to other lands. The group now shares the story of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, bringing hope to others who face similar troubles. And all the while, those from generations before and those who have yet to be born wait patiently for the fish to come back. It has begun. Forests grow, meadows heal, wildlife returns, and farms flourish. The end. Thank you. There's my elevator speech.
Thank you, Urban. So that's, you could say something fairly similar underlies, if I just switch to here, We also put together a slide, another example of a large scale, long-term collaborative governance process, similar to what we've been sort of talking about these 4 weeks, and that both of you and the interests that you represent have been involved in, is the Columbia Basin Partnership. And it arose from sort of tying all these pieces together. Amanda was talking about situation assessments last week, and certainly the largest one that the Ruckelshaus Center has been part of, and one of the largest ones we're aware of in terms of situation assessments, was the Columbia River Salmon and Steelhead assessment that the Ruckelshaus Center did in cooperation with a center like ours at Portland State University, and then colleagues from universities in Idaho and other states. In 2013 and 2014, that NOAA Fisheries asked us to do, that was exploring options for and how people felt about what long-term salmon and steelhead recovery in the Columbia River Basin ought to look like. And that was done in, as I said, 2013, 2014. And coming out of that, the Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force was convened. I think if you look carefully in that picture, you can spot at least one, if not both, of these 2 gentlemen. Certainly.
Probably just Urban.
What's that, Paul?
Probably just Urban. I was kind of in and out of that task force.
That's right. But Yakama Nation was certainly very involved in that.
Yeah. So yeah, early on in the task force, Intertribe represented the 4 treaty tribes in that discussion. And then in phase 2, I was there as Yakama Nation's manager. And then I, of course, left Yakima, went to Intertribe, and so have not really stuck with what's rolled out of that, but is still continuing in some fashion.
And as you can see,
and on that one, Michael, I was fortunate enough to be able to be selected to represent agriculture from the state of Washington as part of that diverse group of folks from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So all really focusing on the Columbia River system and really coming up with what the plan should be that'll work for all of us in the next 100 years. And really, I was real focused on trying to help implement with that group the same concepts that work so well for us through the Yakima plan. So that's the connection.
Yeah. And as you can see, we've got a screenshot of the cover of the phase 2 report from this task force, which was the result of an enormous amount of work. And that work was building on an enormous amount of work, time and years, and time, talent, and treasure that led to a phase 1 report. All of that building on the assessment, but leading to goals, as you can see, to restore thriving salmon and steelhead to the basin that a lot of folks really were surprised this group was able to agree to. Seemed like a very tall order before the group was able to do its work, and has now led to a follow-up process that I think is being called the 4 governors process, because these goals have been handed from this group to the governors of the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana, saying, hey, you are the political leaders in this area. You need to take these and make these real. And so they're working on that next phase called the 4 governors process. So it's still evolving. These are probably 2 of the largest examples of collaborative efforts that you have worked on, but you've worked together and separately on lots of other collaborative efforts, large and small. And I think that those are all interesting things to talk about, and would like us to dig into these efforts, large and small, short-term, long-term. But as interesting as those efforts are, also interesting is your personal relationship and where it came from and how it's developed and how it's affected your work. And I'm hoping we'll get a chance, to get engaged into some of that. So I just have one more slide, which I'm not going to leave up all that long, just to indicate that we're getting into the Q&A part of this, where I want to ask you a couple of questions. I have a number of questions teed up, but I'm more than happy to have my questions go unanswered, I will defer all of my questions to conversation among the two of you, but even better than that, to questions that people who are attending have. So I will keep my eye on the chat box and also have, Hannah and others pipe up if there's questions that we haven't addressed yet. My first priority would be that as folks who are attending have questions for you, that we really make those the things in the forefront. I'd really love to know what they'd like to know and ask, and have the two of you address. But why don't I get us started by asking you to maybe share a little bit more, each share a little bit more about yourselves, maybe a little bit more about where you grew up and how that shaped you as a person. And maybe since we heard from Urban with his excellent fairy tale, maybe I could impose on Paul to go first this time and talk and address that question.
Yeah, so good afternoon. I grew up largely in the Yakima Valley, Toppenish, Washington, from when I was 12. I went to the University of Washington, undergrad and grad school, and then came home and began working in natural resources for the Yakama Nation. And I guess maybe this is getting ahead maybe to some of the other questions that you'd raised, but I came into fisheries in the late 90s when there were a whole listing of ESA listing of salmonids in the Columbia River. And it was subsequent to the sockeye for Snake River listing, and they had attempted to do a recovery plan as a technical exercise, really finding that there was no social filter, there was no engagement with the people in the Snake River that would be affected by that recovery plan. So, fast forward to 97, 98, 99, 2000, and that's when we formed boards like the Upper Columbia Basin Recovery Board. And that's where you began a collaborative process to develop a recovery plan that included that social filter. Kind of getting away from your question, Michael, but I think that each one of us comes into a situation with a different, personality type. If you look at Myers-Briggs, mine said I'd be a better mediator than litigator. I think that's very much true. And it's the person that, represents an organization on these boards can really influence where that board goes. And I think there's some, things that you were presenting in your first lecture, Michael, that I think are really key and fundamental to, a collaborative process. And one of those is having the right people at the table. And two, the second, I think, is really those different organizations being at a place where they've kind of exhausted their adversarial obligations or responsibilities or opportunities. Urban, it's probably, his organization has probably spent a lot of money over the years on aquavilla adjudication of the water rights in the Yakima Basin. And the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan really wasn't able to come to full fruition until that adjudication was beginning to wrap up and wind down. And it was when you're able to leave that adversarial process behind is when this collaborative process arose. And I think that collaboration arises when people realize there's no, I forget what term was the BATNA you used, best alternative to
Negotiated agreement.
Negotiated agreement. When you don't have any other opportunities and, as out of stream water use and in-stream flows for the Yakima Basin, as forest health and the Forest Service lands, as ESA for salmon, is flooding in the Chehalis. When there's something there, everybody has to pay attention to. That's when you start creating that ground for discussion of using collaboration. So it's kind of the situation, the organizations where they're at, and even the individuals that show up for that organization really influence whether a collaborative process is feasible or not. And so I went far astray from your original question. Thank you.
Well, you kind of did, but
but
you also talked about your own, I asked about sort of your background, and you talked about your sort of propensity and personality type and inclination to be more of a sort of a mediator than a litigator. So I mean, I think that was sort of your grounding. So I think you did answer the question. And then there's a question in the chat I want to get to, but before I do that, I just want to check in with Urban. Anything more about sort of your background, where you grew up, how that shaped you as a person that you want to share before we move on from that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael. Well, just really quickly, I, starting out as a very young kid, grew up packing a shovel around, irrigating alfalfa and apple trees and pear trees with my siblings, and really early on, when I started doing that as a kid and growing up, that was after the Columbia River system was in a basically flood control status for over 30 years, and a lot of these irrigation systems were being developed, and nobody really knew what a drought was. And all of a sudden in 1977, we were told that we were only going to get 7% of our water supply, which was such a shock because for decades that had not been the case. And I got pretty interested in what was going on with that. And then as we started going into the 80s, we started getting more these periodic years where things were short, and then getting into the 1990s, and we started getting back-to-back years, 3 in a row where they were dry, and then of course getting in 2000s, they just kept perpetuating again and getting progressively worse. So what really influenced me was seeing what these terrible economic impacts are on agriculture in our area when we didn't get any water. And that's when a lot of the fighting was going on in state court and federal court, and the people on Paul's side and the people on our side, we were talking to each other through lawyers. We weren't talking to each other at all. And in fact, it was discouraged because we might say something wrong. So once we finally got to the point, as Paul said, we got far enough along through the legal process to know pretty much what everybody was going to end up with. And then it became quite clear that we're getting these other outside pressures on our distribution system because of the snowpack is acting differently for some reason, and it's coming at different timing. It's flashing off, or it's not coming at all. It's coming as rain. So we really, and I really started focusing on, we need to do something about this, and just fighting it over isn't going to fix it. Fighting over it isn't going to fix it, because we have to figure out how to retime this water and make it work for everybody. And the only way it's going to work for everybody if we all work together on it. And that's really where our strength has been. And then as we were figuring out what the problem was and is, and what to do about it, and then just getting everybody together and sticking with it, then we started developing relationships with each other, and developing that level of trust and respect, and being able to communicate productively with each other. And when we got those meetings together to get everybody in the room, we purposefully excluded all of the legal counsel and just took the principals in to talk about it. And that actually really helped. I think it would have been much harder the other way.
Thank you. And you know what? We're starting to get some really outstanding questions in the chat. So I want to go there. I may feed some other questions in as we move along, but I want to get to these. So Jay asked a question about how do you balance the important planning and dialogue process that can take a lot of time with all the diverse partners. So how do you balance that with the need to produce outcomes and fulfill people's desires for action. I'm wondering if either or both of you have some thoughts you want to share on that.
It does take time, and ours was really there's several of these questions are all tied in together, but what we didn't have another option because actually, if you look at some of these models that we had in ag in our basin, we were looking at back-to-back years coming up in the not too distant future of a 0% water supply. And we're producing about $5 billion of ag commodities annually in this basin. So that's really how we got so much farmer interest and irrigation entity interests to really get involved and participate in it, because these weren't just models that we were looking at that might happen. We have been progressively and more frequently experiencing what, and when we first started looking at this, our models said would have been 30 years out. So the sense of urgency, I think, as Paul was mentioning about if you're getting in flooding in Chehalis, or if you're dealing with drought or whatever you're dealing with, when you see it and you live it, that motivates people. So yeah, you need to have action, but you got to have a path forward, and you have to have a story to tell, and then you have to have a coalition to go sell it, which is how we got the state of Washington to commit to funding up to 50% of our project costs. The state of Washington committed in a policy bill to fund $2 billion of this project, and it's how we got federal legislation through the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House and signed by the president to do the same, to move forward. So it's, but we had to. It all boiled down to those relationships and in developing those relationships through the process.
Oh, you want to add?
I think reflecting on Carol and David's questions that were posted here. Sorry, Jay, I'll get to your questions too, not to leave you behind there, but in the Upper Columbia, when we formulated that board, it was the late 90s, early 2000s. There'd been enforcement action by NOAA Fisheries on Section 10 permit for an irrigation diversion in Wolf Creek. And the farmer that was impacted by that enforcement action had spent, maybe $100,000 in litigation and had not done well. And there was a recognition up there that something needed to happen. And we kind of blindly started formulating, coming together. Esther Stefanu was a product of the Bronx who had relocated to Chelan County and became a county commissioner. It really was the backbone behind that. And she'd pulled together 3 counties, the 2 tribes, kind of recognizing that those are kind of the actionable parties that could bring together, kind of the right level and scope and scale to have that discussion. But beyond that, we really didn't know what needed to happen. We didn't know what a collaborative process was. All the things that Michael and Amanda talked about, those were tools that were foreign to us. This is 20 years ago. After Michael's presentation 3 weeks ago, I shared that, somewhat broadly. And Tom Tebb, who Urban works with, he's a Department of Ecology director of the Office of Columbia River. He glommed onto it, and I think he recognizes that there are formulations or fundamental things to do to develop the foundation, the groundwork for a collaborative process. In the Upper Columbia, about 7 years ago, we began a forest health discussion that was tiered off of the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board. And fortunately there, we had some people who had a background in this, including Derek Van Marter, who had an MPA, and he'd done a lot of work along the lines of what Michael's done. He had worked with Michael. And they did a lot of foundational work. It took much longer than I thought it would, but in hindsight, I think that's really key. And doing that work, it seems slow on the front end, but it really, I think, helps move the process along in a more productive, fruitful manner than it would be if you were just blindly kind of trying to move forward. And so I would reflect back to Michael's first lecture in this series. Talks about the foundation or fundamental aspects of developing a collaborative process. Beyond that, and this is more just the soft side of it, you start working together and you look for small wins, or you look for small intersections of interest, and maybe just one or two items where farmers and fish people and county commissioners and whomever else where they can come to an agreement. It may be just one item, but you take that as a win, and hopefully you start building on that, and people begin to start trusting each other. You start having broader dialogue. People start thinking more creatively. You start looking at what is your interest as opposed to what your position is, and are there different ways to get to that interest. So it's a kind of a slow iterative process at that personal level, but I think developing the foundation and then having the personal interactions is really where it starts to develop. I think that's what Tom Tev is looking at for maybe someplace like the Walla Walla. And that's where something like the Ruckelshaus Center or even Consensus Center, a situational assessment like Amanda Murphy talked about last week, those are some really key resources that we have in this state that hopefully people recognize the value of and will look to and utilize them. And they may, collaboration may or may not work. It's all dependent on the situation and the people engaged. So
following up on what Paul was just saying, and then both Matt and Carol's questions. Initially, we were able to get together because of some discussions that actually occurred between Phil Rigdon at the Yakama Nation and Ron Van Gundy, who was a longtime manager of the Rosa Irrigation District. And it was really a result of there was a proposal called Black Rock in the Moxie Valley, but it would have been really expensive to pump water up out of the Columbia River into that valley and then provide a large supply of water at that location. But it had several issues. But the main one from the irrigation side was we couldn't see how we could afford the pumping costs for that water supply. So there was the cost issue, plus the Yakimas didn't want water being pumped out of the river at that location and put into that place. So that's, I think, really what really kicked off the discussion, which then got the Bureau of Reclamation involved, and they had some $1.5 million in Water Smart funding for basin planning, and the Department of Ecology also put in $1.5 million, I believe. So we had some money to really get this kickstarted. And then the other piece was, which has already been touched on, is to get the right people at the table. So with the federal agencies and the state agencies and the counties, the municipalities, the irrigation districts, major national environmental groups, to really get that whole group together, which was the work group. But each one of those people that represented all of those entities were carefully selected as people that had the ability to interact with other human beings productively, and also had enough credibility within whatever their respective organizations were to actually be able to speak for that entity, and then go back and bring the others that weren't in the room along. And that is so important, not to just send the very newest employee or the person that doesn't have that credibility with their own group to go to these types of discussions. So the right people at the table. And then also following up on the question, you have to have a really good facilitator that knows what they are doing. There was the facilitator that really helped kick this off. His name was Dan Silver. and he understood water, and he understood a lot of the background, so he didn't have to be brought up to speed, plus the fact he was respected and worked really hard at it. So you have to have the right people in the room, and you have to have a good facilitator to at least give yourself a chance to get something like this to work. But that doesn't guarantee it, but that makes it more likely.
Yeah, so I've been sort of teeing up some questions I've seen that I wanted to make sure, may or may not have been addressed or wasn't clear to people were addressed. And so Urban, I think you just addressed one of them, which was there was a question about at the outset of what became the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan, when there was that transition from, sort of the more litigation focused and were people even allowed to speak with each other, to this transition of, well, I think we've exhausted our BATNAs and we're going to talk to one another. Someone had asked, like, so at that point, was it facilitated? And I think what you just communicated was, yes, there was facilitation involved. And you mentioned Dan Silver, who I think was and maybe still is with Cascadia Consulting, was one of the lead facilitators there. So that's the answer. That's an answer to that question. And Paul kind of had addressed that question as related to the work in the Upper Columbia, where at first it was county commissioner and maybe others sort of doing the convening and saying, hey, we ought to get together and talk. And then they were able to pull in folks like Derek Van Marder, who I think maybe was at Triangle Associates when that was getting started. And then was, I think, working for the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board as an employee. So you can see some of the different models. Sometimes you're bringing in a third party. And then I would say, Urban, that the Yakima Basin Plan had both Dan Silver as a third party facilitator, but also before Tom Tebb was there from Office of River Protection and Columbia and Department of Ecology. In some respects, he also plays a bit of a facilitator convener role, and before him it was Derek Sanderson.
Yeah,
there's role, and he was to some degree. We talked in the intro about how you can be in sort of a facilitator or conflict resolving role from different places, and sometimes it's actually somebody from within government who does not completely have a stake in the outcome. So there's. But a lot of what I was hearing was that Derek was actually playing a big role in some of the facilitation and helping the parties to be successful, even though he wasn't completely a independent third party. So that was kind of an interesting dynamic there.
That's right, Michael. I wanted to cut in on that. So Derek was the head of the Office of the Columbia River at the time. Yeah. And he was instrumental in bringing the Department of Ecology along with this process, which even that was much different than how ecology had been acting before. We could not have pulled this off without Derek Sanderson.
Yeah. So a couple of other questions that I saw teed up that I didn't want to get lost in this conversation, large or small. One is there anything that you would go back and do differently towards the beginning or the outset of any of these or other collaborative processes you've been involved in, sort of that 2020 hindsight? If we were going to get started again on this, knowing what I know now, I would do differently. So something to think about and to address if something stands out to either one of you. And then another really great question about, some of the people who participate in these collaborative processes are doing it, and I'm paraphrasing a little, so apologies to the question asker if I do injury to your question and how I'm rephrasing it a little, but I think I'm getting the gist. There are people in these processes who are participating from a place where they're basically being paid to participate. They're at a state agency or whatever, where that's their job to be participating in the process. But there's others, like in their question, they mentioned farmers who have quote unquote a day job, and both time and money to participate in these processes are challenging for them. So how do you involve people who need to be at the table in order for these agreements to be reached and implemented correctly, but they don't have, it's a struggle for them to fully participate when they don't have the resources, whether those resources are time or money, to participate the same way that others can do it, because it is their job to participate. So those are a couple of questions, and I invite either of you to weigh in on them while I dip back into the chat and see what else.
Go ahead, Paul.
So, I referenced Esther Stefanu in Chelan County, and her statement was, and they still abide by this in that organization, if somebody believes they're a stakeholder, they are a stakeholder. And what really happened there is you have 2 tribal governments, you have 3 county governments, and it's kind of a mid-level, it's grassroots, but not, absolutely grassroots, kind of mid-level government approach to working on the ESA question. And so those people do have the time to participate, but then there needs to be a feedback loop continuously and consistently with the people on the landscape. Back in the 90s, what I've heard is you wouldn't drive a state vehicle into the Entiat Basin because things were so heated there over water rights. But Cascadia Irrigation brought in a person, Sarah Walker, who worked in that basin and really worked to develop relationships and to start having that discussion and communication in the Entiat. And it changed the tenor of, and it brought the level of heat down in the basin to where you could start having those discussions. And so maybe going back to Jay's earlier question, they're going to be the people on the landscape that are working 9-to-5 jobs that don't pay them to be in these discussions. But a lot of these discussions have been held, managed by people responsible to those landowners, to those farmers, those producers, all of who are stakeholders. And, for Upper Columbia Board, it's been county commissioners who are elected by these individuals. So essentially working on their behalf. Same thing with the irrigation districts. Urban represents the farmers that are within his district. And so there's that kind of intertie, I guess is what I would say. I want to get to Jay's question on why we're one when we get a chance. So yeah,
just real quickly, the Paul, on the farmer participating here, in addition to those of us that are responsible for representing farmers, we do get a lot of individual farmer participation because of I link it back to the high value crops that we're growing in the Yakima Basin, and there's a lot at risk. So we have plenty of interest in participation and support for what we're doing to protect that ag economy. At the same time, we're found a way to bring 300,000 fish back up the river. And then you take a shot at the Whatcom question, and if there's time, I will as well.
So really quickly, Jay, and I know Jay through the mentoring program with Ag Forestry, not every situation is going to be ripe for a collaborative effort. And when there's ongoing litigation, it's adversarial type of approach to resolving things. I think maybe that partially goes back to the BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated outcome. If people have alternatives, I think they can get more or get what they need, what they want, and they won't come to the table in good faith. That's not a place to work towards collaboration. That's a place to put it back in the courts and let people fight it out. So it's, every situation is going to be in a little bit different place, and they're not all going to be receptive to collaboration.
So on that, I didn't look after the legislature just ended and make sure it was still in there, but I thought that there was some funding for a discussion process by the county executive and others to really take a look at what if there's some sort of discussion process that will work there or could work there. So maybe there's some hope in that. I think there might have been some opportunities for Jay Manning and some of the folks from that group to be participating in that as well. So if there is a discussion process through the county executive and them, I would say the best thing to do is try to follow it and participate if possible.
Yeah, and I would say that I think Paul and Urban's counsel is pretty wise on this, that as Paul says, the people who would need to participate in a collaborative process need to feel like that's their that's their BATNA, that's the process through which they have the best chance of meeting their interests. And if they're not ready, then I think it's about sort of being ready to step in when that energy has sort of expended itself and people are like, okay, we've kind of thrown ourselves against that particular wall long enough and haven't gotten where we need to go, which kind of ties in with your question from the beginning of about like, how do you deal with people saying this is going to take too long before we get to results? And the really simplest way of addressing that is saying, how long has it taken you to get where you are so far? And are you happy with where you are? Like, how long has it taken you to not resolve these issues with a non-collaborative approach? So if yes, of course, it will take time, and to do it right takes time. Everything that is worth doing is slow and painful and hard and often expensive, and all those criticisms, but the alternatives are not, they might be faster, they might also be cheaper sometimes, but that's because the results aren't very good. So
Hey, Michael, we've got 3 minutes, and I just wanted to touch on one more thing, that as we were preparing the Yakima plan, it's not just a static list of projects that are going to be implemented. It is a nimble, adaptive plan that we actually we are able now to utilize the relationships that we've created and established through that process to deal with other issues. So, for example, there's a ESA consultation process that's been languishing for 21 years on steelhead in the Yakima Basin with the National Marine Fisheries Service on the Bureau of Reclamation project operations. Because of this group, the strength of this group that we have together, we are now participating, everybody is participating in a process to come up with a way to utilize the integrated plan projects that we know are authorized and that we will be implementing, and then figure out what's the priority of the projects that are going to be implemented in the next, say, decade. That we'll be able to figure out how to get written into a Section 7 process and use this collaborative process to deal with achieving a non-jeopardy opinion as we implement, really getting our ultimate goal, which is harvestable and sustainable, and more aspirational goals with the fish, but we're protecting ag at the same time. So we are now evolving into the collaborative process with the federal agencies through ESA because of collaborative governance, that process that you've been describing over the past 4 weeks.
That's great. Hey, Paul, we'll consider that Urban's final thought. You got a final thought for us before we have to wrap up?
No, but go back and look at Michael's first presentation on this. I think it was great. I think it's a good primer.
Best I've ever seen, Michael.
Wow.
Good job, Hannah, for putting this together.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Hannah, it looks like we've got 1 minute before we're done. So probably not enough time for me to ask them a wrap-up question or anything like that. So maybe I should just turn it back over to you to put a bow on this series and just say thank you so much for inviting us. I hope you agree. It feels to me like this was a great way to wrap up this series with these two amazing gentlemen and their perspective of what it looks like when you take what Amanda and I have been talking about and actually apply it to big and small policy challenges in our state, particularly on the types of issues that folks in the ag forestry program wrestle with every day. So, I hope that feels like a nice way to wrap up this series.
Yes. Thank you all for putting this together. I think, like Paul said, it was so great to have the primer, the walkthrough, the theory, and then to get to hear your guys' thoughts and insights on the application. I think collaboration, I heard multiple times, it takes time. You have to be patient and not everybody's ready. And so you have to just wait until everybody is so exhausted that they're ready. And so that takes a lot of patience. And so application of collaboration is a lot different and a lot harder than it sounds in Like Michael, when you put up that slide and you said, gosh, this makes it look like each of these stages is equal and easy and it flows linearly, and it doesn't. So we appreciate you guys so much for putting together this series. I am so excited that we have these recordings. So if you are on this webinar, please share these recordings. We want these to be a resource for you and for others as you continue and need to refresh or send others and inspire others to join in collaborative processes. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, panelists, Paul, Urban, and Michael, for being with us. And people are starting to sign off, so I know they're heading to their next meeting. So we will sign off as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.